Welcome back to our reading of the Life Divine. We're now into chapter 25, the Triple Transformation. Triple Transformation, because the evolution of consciousness upon Earth, representatively for the cosmos, is incomplete unless it emerges in the individual as a particularizing truth, as a vast universalizing consciousness, and then finally as a consciousness which transcendental yet penetrates, integralizes, and transforms the life in which it lives. So that means, in Sri Aurobindo's language, a psychic transformation, the emergence of the hidden soul in us, so that it stands in front in nature and is visible, palpable through our mental vision, in our life energies, our emotions, and vibrant in our body. That's the first step. That is already a yoga. The second is the realization of the universal consciousness of the Supreme Self. It is transcendent, but it is also active and dynamic in the universe. That also has to be realized and penetrate mind, life, and body just as the soul power does as it emerges from inside. So individual, universal, in one. So someone who is no longer primarily centered in the appetites or the ego of the limited human figure, but somebody who knows to the very root what she or he is, and then finds the larger self to be commensurate with that. So the point is the circle. The circle is embedded in the point. That is a preparation for a great change of consciousness in which a dynamic truth power, directly representative of existence, consciousness, bliss, can make itself felt directly in nature, no longer as a hidden presence, but directly. That would be the supramental evolution, the supramental transformation. So the psychic, the spiritual, and the supramental transformation are the three that make up the body of this chapter and what he's addressing. Of course, these things Sri Aurobindo was working out in the inner laboratory of his own life and in the outer laboratory of the ashram life around him. So as we read, we should not be thinking that these sentences are merely academic or intellectual, but they relate powerfully to life as it was and is being lived. Then and there, here and now. So, when he was talking about the psychic transformation, he said we have to get to the fundamental truth behind each individual, which is that there is a psyche there, a psychic entity, which is immortal, which is unmoving, unchanged. And yet, this is the truth at the core of our being. What emerges over this being's evolution in time is a psychic personality, a psychic being, where this psychic entity, based on its essence, moves into the materia of nature, into the physical, into its vital power, into its lucent mind corridors, and begins to impress itself upon that. And what is formed is a psychic personality. It is not the deepest soul itself, but it is something that converses and dances with nature, representing this psyche. Now, psyche, psychic personality. If it were easy for this psyche to master and govern nature, then we would be proceeding along at a very rapid pace in evolution. But the instruments, body, life, and mind, even the subtle subliminal instruments, of which body, life, and mind are the exteriorizations, are themselves, of course, based in the inconscience of nature, and so are slow to change. And even those subtle instruments blend with the psychic influence when it's emerging from inside, from behind, and diminish the purity and power of the soul's force. So the soul has, in a sense, to wrestle or dance with nature and slowly, slowly gain advantage, life after life after life. So what stands here on the surface represents the pure soul behind, but is often diminished or mixed with the outer nature to the point that it is difficult for us to discern what is the soul and what is not. And so this is where we pick up Sri Aurobindo's argument tonight. The life divine, the triple transformation. Moreover, the psychic being, the soul personality in us, does not emerge full-grown and luminous. It evolves, passes through a slow development and formation. Its figure of being may be at first indistinct and may afterwards remain for a long time weak and undeveloped, not impure, but imperfect. For it rests its formation, its dynamic self-building, on the power of soul that has been actually, or more or less successfully, against the resistance of the ignorance and inconscience, put forth in the evolution upon the surface. Its appearance is the sign of a soul emergence in nature, and if that emergence is as yet small and defective, the psychic personality also will be stunted or feeble. It is, too, by the obscurity of our consciousness, separated from its inner reality, in imperfect communication with its own source in the depths of the being. For the road is as yet ill-built, easily obstructed, the wires often cut or crowded with communications of another kind and proceeding from another origin. Its power to impress what it receives upon the outer instruments is also imperfect. In its penury, poverty, it has, for most things, to rely on these instruments, and it forms its push to expression and action on their data, and not solely on the unerring perceptions of the psychic entity. So we get a picture of a developing psychic personality that's meeting and interfacing with the external world through imperfect media within itself, but building slowly its power. But you can't expect it to act perfectly. It errs, it corrects itself, and when it's able to hear the inner promptings, then its movements are facile. When it is clouded, then its movements stumble. In these conditions, it cannot prevent the true psychic light from being diminished or distorted in the mind into a mere idea or opinion. The psychic will to action in the life parts into a blind vital enthusiasm, or a fervid excitement. It even accepts these mistranslations for want of something better and tries to fulfill itself through them. So, the light, the feeling, the will. These are again tacitly extensions of Satchit Ananda, that which is real, that which is consciousness, that which is delight. So the psyche, in a sense, represents the essence of that in manifestation. As we've seen earlier, it is particularly expressive of the Anandic principle, the principle of bliss. The psyche manifests in the cosmos in order to discover the hidden delight in the universe. For it is part of the work of the soul to influence mind and heart and vital being and turn their ideas, feelings, enthusiasms, dynamisms in the direction of what is divine and luminous. But this has to be done at first imperfectly, slowly, and with a mixture. As the psychic personality grows stronger, it begins to increase its communion with the psychic entity behind it and improve its communications with the surface. It can transmit its intimations to the mind and heart and life with a greater purity and force, for it is more able to exercise a strong control and react against false mixtures. Now, more and more, it makes itself felt distinctly as a power in the nature. But even so, this evolution would be slow and long if left solely to the difficult automatic action of the evolutionary energy. It is only when man awakes to the knowledge of the soul and feels a need to bring it to the front and make it the master of his life and action that a quicker conscious method of evolution intervenes and a psychic transformation becomes possible. This slow development can be aided by the mind's clear perception and insistence on something within that survives the death of the body and an effort to know its nature. But at first, this knowledge is impeded by the fact that there are many elements in us, many formations which present themselves as soul elements and can be mistaken for the psyche. In the early Greek and some other traditions about the afterlife, the descriptions given show very clearly that what was then mistaken for the soul was a subconscious formation, a sub-physical impression mold or shadow form of the being, or else a wraith or ghost of the personality. This ghost, which is mistakenly called the spirit, is sometimes a vital formation, reproducing the man's characteristics, his surface life mannerisms, sometimes a subtle physical prolongation of the surface form of the mind shell. At best, it is a sheath of the life personality, which still remains in the front for some time after the departure from the body. So again, the mind could help with the emergence of the soul if it understood what the soul is, but its first glance at that which seems to survive the body is to detect, rather than the soul, some fragment, some piece of the vital nature which is left, something sometimes of a subtle physical sheath which is still floating in the atmosphere. But none of these things are the soul. That's what really survives the death, and we have a sense of the immortality, but not a sense of what it is. We know that it is, but we don't know what it is when we gauge with the mind. He continues, apart from these confusions born of an after-death contact with discarded phantasms or remnants of the sheaths of the personality, the difficulty is due to our ignorance of the subliminal parts of our nature and the form and powers of the conscious being or Purusha which preside over their action. Owing to this inexperience, we can easily mistake something of the inner mind or vital self for the psyche. So we don't know our inner selves. When he talks about the subliminal being, the surface being would be obviously the physical body, the exoteric mind, the easily detectable vital power that moves us. But the subliminal is that which is behind the line, which is veiled from our vision. So we might, simply by contacting the subliminal part of our nature, think that we found the soul, because it's extraordinary. It seems supernal. It's vividly different from everything that we sense on the surface of our being. So isn't this the divine element in us? And it is only as we gather experience and discrimination that we can see that, there's something still more divine, something still more deep behind and beyond these subliminal elements of the nature. So this is a section which is going to lead us into a little bit of the Sankhyan philosophy, and you pull that back to you. We'll need that terminology in a moment. For as being is one yet multiple, so also the same law prevails in ourselves and our members. The spirit, the Purusha, is one, but it adapts itself to the formations of nature. So Purusha is a word that really means person. But in the Sankhyan philosophy, it is the person who is a witness consciousness that views nature, Prakriti, and comes to distinguish witness from nature, soul from the activity of the universe. And what is the universe? Also includes our mental thoughts, perceptions, our emotions, not simply the physical body, but all of that stands outside the being of the conscious person. Yet, that being also supports the universe. That deep stance, which allows you to see that, I am different from that, is also supportive of that nature at every level. And if the universe is a multi-leveled reality through which we evolve, we can see that the spirit, the conscious person, supports each stage of it. And what is true of the universe is true also of us, individually. Let's read that sentence again. For as being is one yet multiple, so also the same law prevails in ourselves and our members. The spirit, the Purusha, is one, but it adapts itself to the formations of nature. Over each grade of our being, a power of the spirit presides. We have within us, and discover when we go deep enough inwards, a mind self, a life self, a physical self, Manomaya Purusha, Pranamaya Purusha, Annamaya Purusha. There is a being of mind, a mental Purusha, expressing something of itself on our surface in the thoughts, perceptions, activities of our mind nature. A being of life, which expresses something of itself in the impulses, feelings, sensations, desires, external life activities of our vital nature. A physical being, a being of the body, which expresses something of itself in the instincts, habits, formulated activities of our physical nature. These beings are part selves of the self in us, are powers of the spirit, and therefore not limited by their temporary expression. For what is thus formulated is only a fragment of its possibilities, but the expression creates a temporary mental, vital, or physical personality which grows and develops even as the psychic being or soul personality grows and develops within us. Each has its own distinct nature, its influence, its action on the whole of us. But on our surface, all these influences and all this action, as they come up, mingle and create an aggregate surface being which is a composite, an amalgam of them all, an outer persistent and yet shifting and mobile formation for the purposes of this life and its limited experience. So, within there is a psychic entity, a soul essence, let's say. There is a psychic personality which develops over the course of evolution, allowing this entity to interface with nature. The natural elements are all supported by the Purusha, the conscious spirit, which is not, you can see, identical with the psychic being, but is there in the play of nature, the two who are one and play in many worlds. The Purusha, the Sat, supporting the play of consciousness, the Chit. But the point he's making here, if we understand the architecture of what he's talking about, is that all the movements, all the ramifications, the many influences combining, arrive to the surface in an aggregate which can be quite confused. So he continues, but this aggregate is, because of its composition, a heterogeneous compound, not a single harmonious and homogeneous whole. This is the reason why there is a constant confusion and even a conflict in our members, which our mental reason and will are moved to control and harmonize, and have often much difficulty in creating out of their confusion or conflict some kind of order and guidance. Even so, ordinarily, we drift too much, or are driven by the stream of our nature, and act from whatever in it comes uppermost at the time, and seizes the instruments of thought and action. Even our seemingly deliberate choice is more of an automatism than we imagine. Our coordination of our multifarious elements and of our consequent thoughts, feelings, impulses, actions by the reason and will is incomplete and a half measure. In animal being, nature acts by her own mental and vital intuitions. She works out an order by the compulsion of habit and instinct which the animal implicitly obeys, so that the shiftings of its consciousness do not matter. So you have a picture here of nature knowing full well what her business is and working it out however she must. And so long as we are subject to the play of nature, she does the work in us. We think that we think. We think that we feel. It is she who is thinking in us, she who is feeling in us, she who is driving our movements forward. And this all the way through till we reach even the early phases of humanity is a fundamental truth. Now he continues, but man cannot altogether act in the same way without forfeiting his prerogative of manhood. He cannot leave his being to be a chaos of instincts and impulses regulated by the automatism of nature. Mind has become conscious in him and is therefore self-compelled to make some attempt, however elementary in many, to see and control, and in the end, more and more perfectly harmonize the manifold components, the different and conflicting tendencies that seem to make up his surface being. So we are pushed, you can say by nature if you like, or you can say by the elective power of the Spirit within us, to govern and perfect our natural instruments, to move forward, to assert ourselves. Yes, we are driven when we're unconscious automata, but as we become awake and aware of ourselves, we are expected to resist the impulse of nature, to learn to control, to ameliorate, to improve, to step beyond our given nature and exceed our given nature. This is what it means to be human. We're always restless, as we've noted before in one of these evenings. You know, all other beings are seemingly content, but the human is never content, cannot be content, always wants to see more, experience more, do more, because there is this relentless urge in us to outgrow our past selves, not be content with our current selves, but arrive at what we may be. He does succeed, Sri Aurobindo writes, in setting up a sort of regulated chaos or ordered confusion in him, or at least succeeds in thinking that he is directing himself by his mind and will, even though in fact that direction is only partial. For not only a disparate consortium, that is, an unequal fellowship of habitual motive forces, but also newly emergent vital and physical tendencies and impulses, not always calculable or controllable, and many incoherent and inharmonious mental elements use his reason and will, enter into and determine his self-building, his nature development, his life action. Man is, in his self, a unique person. But he is also, in his manifestation of self, a multi-person. He will never succeed in being master of himself until the person imposes itself on his multi-personality and governs it. But this can only be imperfectly done by this surface mental will and reason. It can be perfectly done only if he goes within and finds whatever central being is by its predominant influence at the head of all his expression and action. In inmost truth, it is his soul that is this central being. But in outer fact, it is often one or other of the part beings in him that rules. And this representative of the soul, this deputy self, he can mistake for the inmost soul principle. So as we've seen, our personhood supports each level of our nature, impersonally and personally. So we have the physical sheath, we have the vital sheath, we have the mental sheath, all cooperating and forming this vehicle, this instrumental nature, which we call ourselves. This is the multi-person to whom he refers. But also, there is within this psychic being, this personality which is developed as an outthrow from the psychic essence or entity inside. And only when this has been able to come to the front and dominate the nature can we say that we found the soul. Otherwise, we can mistake any of these other elements for the central truth of our being, The central truth of our being is this psyche. But what stands at the front of our evolution at the moment, let's say we're led by the mind, we'll think it's the Manomaya Purusha, we'll mistake that for the soul. Let's say that we're all about the adventure and we're going out and going to meet the world with great spirit and gusto, then we would be dominated by the vital person in us, the Pranamaya Purusha, and that would be standing as the central truth of our being. Not the final central truth, but for the moment, it'll do. And so it goes. So this gets us back to his earlier point about how we mistake some element of us for the real soul. This rule of different selves in us is at the root of the stages of the development of human personality, which we have already had occasion to differentiate. And we can reconsider them now from the point of view of the government of the nature by the inner principle. In some human beings, it is the physical Purusha, the being of body, who dominates the mind, will, and action. There is then created the physical man, mainly occupied with his corporeal life and habitual needs, impulses, life habits, mind habits, body habits, looking very little or not at all beyond that, subordinating and restricting all his other tendencies and possibilities to that narrow formation. If you would allow me an aside here, Sri Aurobindo, of course, was a first-rate Greek scholar. And much of what he is writing here would remind you, if you went back and looked at it, of Plato's Republic, where Socrates is describing the various elements of society and how different people represent different forces. So have a look if you haven't read it before. Go find it. It's a big, one of the large dialogues. So happy hunting. But even in the physical man, there are other elements, and he cannot live altogether as the human animal concerned with birth and death and procreation and the satisfaction of common impulses and desires and the maintenance of the life and the body. This is his normal type of personality, but it is crossed, however feebly, with influences by which he can proceed, if they are developed, to a higher human evolution. If the inner, subtle, physical Purusha insists, he can arrive at the idea of a finer, more beautiful and perfect physical life and hope or attempt to realize it in his own or in the collective or group existence. So, you see, we haven't really left even the belt of the physical life at this point, but we've become awake of something which is truer, something which calls to beauty, which lifts us towards a perfection of the body, even as we live in that life. And you can find this often in the stylized life of the Greeks, of many of the Romans, in the life of the athlete. This is, you could say, a beginning emergence of the soul's power at the level of the body. In others, it is the vital self, the being of life, who dominates and rules the mind, the will, the action. Then is created the vital man, concerned with self-affirmation, self-aggrandizement, life enlargement, satisfaction of ambition and passion and impulse and desire, the claims of his ego, domination, power, excitement, battle and struggle, inner and outer adventure. All else is incidental or subordinated to this movement and building and expression of the vital ego. But still, in the vital man, too, there are or can be other elements of a growing mental or spiritual character. even if these happen to be less developed than his life personality and life power. The nature of the vital man is more active, stronger, and more mobile, more turbulent and chaotic, often to the point of being quite unregulated than that of the physical man, who holds on to the soil and has a certain material poise and balance, but is more kinetic and creative. For the element of the vital being is not earth, but air. It has more movement, less status. A vigorous vital mind and will can grasp and govern the kinetic vital energies, but it is more by a forceful compulsion and constraint than by a harmonization of the being. If, however, a strong vital personality, mind and will, can get the reasoning intelligence to give it a firm support and be its minister, then a certain kind of forceful formation can be made, more or less balanced, but always powerful, successful, and effective, which can impose itself on the nature and environment and arrive at a strong self-affirmation in life and action. This is the second step of harmonized formulation possible in the ascent of the nature. So you can see him taking us from the first step of the physical to the second step of the vital, moving towards kind of rounded perfection, bringing other elements into it, but forcefully. At a higher stage of the evolution of personality, the being of mind may rule. There is then created the mental man, who lives predominantly in the mind, as the others live in the vital or the physical nature. The mental man tends to subordinate to his mental self-expression, mental aims, mental interests, or to a mental idea or ideal, the rest of his being. Because of the difficulty of this subordination and its potent effect when achieved, it is at once more difficult for him and easier to arrive at a harmony of his nature. It is easier because the mental will, once in control, can convince by the power of the reasoning intelligence and at the same time dominate, compress, or suppress the life and the body and their demands, arrange and harmonize them, force them to be its instruments, even reduce them to a minimum so that they shall not disturb the mental life or pull it down from its ideative or idealizing movement. It is more difficult because life and body are the first powers, and if they are in the least strong, can impose themselves with an almost irresistible insistence on the mental ruler. Man is a mental being, and the mind is the leader of his life and body. But this is a leader who is much led by his followers and has sometimes no other will than what they impose on him. This, by the way, is a reference to the Mundaka Upanishad, chapter 2, section 2, verse 8. Mind, in spite of its power, is often impotent before the inconscient and subconscient, which obscure its clarity and carry it away on the tide of instinct or impulse. In spite of its clarity, it is fooled by vital and emotional suggestions into giving sanction to ignorance and error, to wrong thought and to wrong action. Or it is obliged to look on while the nature follows what it knows to be wrong, dangerous, or evil. To Horace and Latin. I see the better way and approve of it. I follow the worse. Even when it is strong and clear, and dominant. Mind, though it imposes a considerable mentalized harmony, cannot integrate the whole being and nature. These harmonizations by an inferior control are besides inconclusive, because it is one part of the nature which dominates and fulfills itself, while the others are coerced and denied their fullness. They can be steps on the way, but not final. Therefore, in most men, there is no such soul dominance and affected partial harmony, but only a predominance, and for the rest, an unstable equilibrium of a personality half formed, half in formation, sometimes a disequilibrium or unbalance due to the lack of a central government or the disturbance of a formerly achieved partial poise. So, if we're living stationed primarily in one part of our nature, if we're primarily a mental being, or primarily a vital being, or primarily a physical being, and working in association, mutuality with the other parts of our nature, we will still never achieve a real balance, a harmony, an equilibrium, because it is one part of the nature leading the others, and they will not agree. He is leading us to a concluding paragraph here. All must be transitional until a first, though not a final, true harmonization is achieved by finding our real center. For the true central being is the soul. But this being stands back, and in most human natures is only the secret witness, or one might say, a constitutional ruler who allows his ministers to rule for him, delegates to them his empire, silently assents to their decisions, and only now and then puts in a word which they can at any moment override and act otherwise. But this is so long as the soul personality put forward by the psychic entity is not yet sufficiently developed. When this is strong enough for the inner entity to impose itself through it, then the soul can come forward and control the nature. It is by the coming forward of this true monarch and his taking up of the reins of government that there can take place a real harmonization of our being and our life. So, speaking here of the psychic transformation, it is only when this secret soul from within stands forward and governs the nature that we can bring into harmony all the elements of existence. This is the first requirement of the evolving person. It is not the last. But this, each person who seeks the soul can achieve in this life. You've been called by something to inquire into the possibilities of spiritual existence, which means that that immortal principle in you is coming nearer and nearer the surface. Now, if your gaze turns within and you discover what it is that you truly are, then you will live out the truth of that drop of Satchit under which you are. Because knowing what you are, being conscious of what you are, will lead you to delight. And that delight will smoothen all the rough edges of the nature and bring to felicity all the powers that sleep usually within you, undiscovered, untapped, and you will have richer vision, more exuberant life energies, a radiant body, all based on the power of the soul's presence. This you can do here and now, as they say in Sanskrit, ihaiva. So, we read a passage about a year ago from Savitri, which we're going to read again now. This is in Book 7, the Book of Yoga, Canto 2, the parable of the search for the soul. Our larger being sits behind cryptic walls. There are greatnesses hidden in our unseen parts that wait their hour to step into life's front. We feel an aid from deep indwelling gods. One speaks within. Light comes to us from above. Our soul from its mysterious chamber acts. Its influence, pressing on our heart and mind, pushes them to exceed their mortal selves. It seeks for good and beauty and for God. We see beyond self's walls our limitless self. We gaze through our world's glass at half-seen vasts. We hunt for the truth behind apparent things. Our inner mind dwells in a larger light. Its brightness looks at us through hidden doors. Our members luminous grow, and wisdom's face appears in the doorway of the mystic ward. When she enters into our house of outward sense, then we look up and see above her sun. A mighty life-self with its inner powers supports the dwarfish modicum we call life. It can graft upon our crawl 2 puissant wings. Our body's subtle self is throned within in its viewless palace of veridical dreams that are bright shadows of the thoughts of God. In the prone, obscure beginnings of the race, the human grew in the bowed ape-like man. He stood erect, a godlike form and force, and a soul's thoughts looked out from earth-born eyes. Man stood erect, he wore the thinker's brow. He looked at heaven and saw his comrade stars. A vision came of beauty and greater birth, slowly emerging from the heart's chapel of light, and moved in a white, lucent air of dreams. He saw his being's unrealized vastnesses. He aspired and housed the nascent demigod. Out of the dim recesses of the self, the occult seeker into the open came. He heard the far and touched the intangible. He gazed into the future and the unseen. He used the powers earth instruments cannot use, a pastime made of the impossible. He caught up fragments of the omniscient's thought. He scattered formulas of omnipotence. Thus, man, in his little house made of earth's dust, grew towards an unseen heaven of thought and dream, looking into the vast vistas of his mind on a small globe dotting infinity. At last, climbing a long and narrow stair, he stood alone on the high roof of things, and saw the light of a spiritual sun. Aspiring, he transcends his earthly self. He stands in the largeness of his soul newborn, redeemed from encirclement by mortal things, and moves in a pure, free spiritual realm as in the rare breath of a stratosphere. A last end of far lines of divinity, he mounts by a frail thread to his high source. He reaches his fount of immortality. He calls the Godhead into his mortal life. All this the Spirit concealed had done in her. A portion of the mighty Mother came into her as into its own human part. Amid the cosmic workings of the gods, it marked her the center of a wide-drawn scheme, dreamed in the passion of her far-seeing spirit to mold humanity into God's own shape and lead this great, blind, struggling world to light, or a new world discover or create. Earth must transform herself and equal heaven, or heaven descend into earth's mortal state. But for such vast spiritual change to be, out of the mystic cavern in man's heart, the heavenly psyche must put off her veil and step into common nature's crowded rooms and stand uncovered in that nature's front and rule its thoughts and fill the body and life. So, we continue next week. Namaste. Jai Ma. And to all our dear friends,